afternoon, everyone. I have taken over responsibility for Clandeboye. Lindy died in October 2020. Up to that point, obviously, Clandeboye had largely been her private home, and she really having taken it on following the death of her husband Sheridan in 1988. So from that point on, Clandeboye essentially passed into a private trust, which is charitable in nature, but which she and Sheridan had set up in 1988 before his untimely death. And I'm currently the chair of the trustees, of which there are 3 who have the responsibility for taking that forward. So you will have heard this morning about the importance of the first Marquess. I'm not going to repeat that. It's in large part why this project is going ahead. But if you look back at it from a sort of slightly remote perspective, it is quite remarkable that from rural County Down you had 2 such illustrious diplomats. You had Dufferin, you had Lord Castlereagh, and that in itself, I think, is quite remarkable and something which is to be lauded. So my enthusiasm for this project, I suppose, grew out of that premise, that it's for the benefit not just of their respective legacies, but also, or indeed the houses from which they came, but actually for the benefit of Northern Ireland, that we perhaps acknowledge something great coming from Northern Ireland, which is sadly known so much for what is wrong and the negative. And yet, it would be wrong for me not to acknowledge that the strength of the Ulster diaspora, given that there are sort of 15 US presidents who have had connections to this part of the world, again in itself is quite remarkable. So this tiny little province, but all of these things emanating from it and going out into the world, and that is where I think the global significance of this project really plays into play. So I mentioned the trust that the last Lord and Lady Dufferin set up. They set it up in 1988, not very long before Sheridan Dufferin died. And the model loosely from which it is taken is, some of you may know the Soane Museum at Lincoln's Inn Fields. I used to work 3 doors down, so it's somewhere very close to my heart. The Soane Museum was largely 3 townhouses in a London square put together, but it has an amazing collection both of artistic, from Hogarth to Canaletto, but it also has a lot of physical items, things which have come from all over the globe and which Soane collected and wanted kept in those 3 townhouses in Lincoln's Inn Fields. So that is very loosely the model on which was adopted for the Dufferin Foundation. That, the artistic element, and then the physical items which were collected into a private collection. And Soane in 1833 was able to negotiate a private act of parliament, which then came into effect on his death in 1837, which kept that collection together in perpetuity. Now, sadly, in 1988, the Dufferins didn't have the ability to have a private act of parliament. That whole process had somewhat changed by that stage. But the principle of it is really what is enshrined and is the backbone of the Dufferin Foundation. So back to Soane, still operating, has 100,000 visitors a year to what is a comparatively small museum in a discrete part of London, but also has connections to this part of the world in that Soane, as an architect, was instrumental in the design of Barons Court, a house owned by the Dukes of Abercorn in Tyrone, and loosely Clandeboye through his number 2 Woodgate. So there are lots of synergies to that. The objects of the Dufferin Foundation fundamentally are the achievement of education in and promotion of academic research into the role of Clandeboye and into the Dufferin family in Canada, Ireland, India, France, Turkey, Italy, and Russia, and other countries in which the first Marquess might have been involved. So, dare I say it, the objectives in that 1988 document resonate very strongly to the project that we're talking about today. In addition to that, the foundation of the Trust is, obviously and very importantly, the preservation and protection and indeed improvement of the built environment that makes up Clandeboye, mostly an environment that was created in the 19th century. And now, more importantly, or as importantly, the collection that is housed within it, and which in itself, in many different ways, spans the globe and encompasses the life of the first Lord Dufferin, and very importantly, his wife, who became a very significant personage in her own right in the empire. And tangentially to that, and perhaps certainly with a focus on this, we have very much the promotion of education and health within our remit, which is why the Dufferin Foundation is so closely aligned to NIFSA, who are represented here today. Now, Joy asked me to speak very briefly about why we were involved. Well, I've given you the history of it, I've given you the objectives, you can see the synergies in that. But certainly from the position of the trustees, we also need a plan. Lindy Dufferin isn't dead that terribly long. We've spent a lot of time in the intervening period with the help of people like Willie Lorimer, who you've heard from this morning, compiling a fuller inventory of exactly what we have, what those connections are to the wider global peace, and how they can be used in the life in which we live today. Those links to the empire, to Burma, etc. But adding to that dimension, we also have the very considerable art collection which Lindy Dufferin collected in her own right, she and her husband. Her husband was an art dealer, representing people from Hockney through to Bacon. Sadly, we have no Bacons. But it is very interesting to see a snapshot of that eclectic 1960s life and how that was also related to Ulster. And in Lindy's case, obviously, she was an artist in her own right, so she has her own collection, but also a collection which itself is important in that she was very close to Duncan Grant as one of the significant figures in the Bloomsbury group. And certainly since her death, we have worked very closely with Bloomsbury and Charleston to try and bring forward some of the learning from that large collection. And the other thread, which I think, given the leadership of this project, reflects upon very strong women, of which there are more than a few in the hierarchy of this project. I shall go no further than that. But when I look at that in the terms of Clandeboye, you start with someone who inherits an Ulster plantation in the personage of Dorcas. And then you go through that through Helen, the eponymous tower, Helen's Bay, Dufferin's mother, her sister Caroline Norton, who was a significant figure in her own right. As a lawyer, which is what my background is, she was instrumental in the implementation of the Married Women's Property Act. Antonia Fraser has written a really good book about that life. And then, of course, we have Harriet, who, as a vicereine and the wife of a diplomat going through what was a crucial stage of English history, with a lot of personal connections and personal descriptions of their life, can add, I think, a lot of dimension into a project like this. And finally, of course, Lindy herself. She was no shrinking violet. She had a huge connection to the world in which she inhabited, and some of which I think is important to try and collect to show the evolution of an estate like Clandeboye through from that 19th century strength right through to the modern day. I used to describe her as the Orlando of North Downs, which was not too far disconnected from the truth. So there are lots of interesting themes for the trustees to develop, but we cannot do it. We have a finite resource. And one of the strengths, I think, of a project like this is being able to bring at least some of those strands together and to be able to develop them. We are very open as a trust to working in partnership and joint ventures with all sorts of public bodies, academic institutions, other charities, but always, I guess, with an angle to multiplying the effect and benefit that we can bring, knowing that our own resources are actually comparatively limited. We sadly don't have the National Trust sitting behind us in terms of firepower. But we have started. We have some examples. NIFSA, we are opening a new school, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, which was built in honor of Lindy's memory. And that is something which is very dear to her heart, bringing education and the environment together within the context of Clandeboye, and yet multiplying that effect across a lot of the primary school educations in Northern Ireland, and particularly in the North Down area. Charleston, I've mentioned, we've already participated in a number of exhibitions and are working with them for a major Bloomsbury exhibition, which is almost a reinventing the story of Bloomsbury, which the Tate will run in 2026. We've done some work on the restoration of the fabric of the built environment. We've done some work at Helen's Tower to try and maintain that for the future, but also as part of the process of connecting it with the environment, but also reconnecting it with the people who use that area. Helen's Tower, as some of you may or may not know, built as a memorial to Helen Dufferin, but then adopted by the 36th Ulster Division as a commemoration and as a symbol for the sacrifice that they sustained during the First World War at the Battle of the Somme. So all of that is really important heritage that needs to be preserved, but also needs to be brought to life in a more modern context. And in short, that is why I think this project is something which will help us on that journey. It is one of those very important strands, and hopefully will give us a direction both internally to Clandeboye, but externally in the wider academic and indeed global context. And that's really what the trustees' job is. So with that, many thanks to Joy and indeed her team.